think he brought a healthy part of his congregation tonight. And so if you're here from Liberty Baptist Church, welcome to you. I'd also like to thank Bo Sayers. Bo is a graduate of William Jewell. He said I could not say what year he graduated from Jewell. And so I'm not going to. But Bo was a student who was very involved in campus when he was here, a leader on our campus. And a couple of months ago he called and said, would you be interested in hosting a debate? And so we talked, and then the people who were involved in the debate, we met, and I think came up with a good format and a good program for you to share in tonight. I would like to say, if you are going to cheer for the history side, you need to be on this side of the room and myth on this. No, I'm kidding. We're not going to do that. The format for the debate that's been agreed upon by Jeremy and Josh is that they will each make a 12-minute opening statement, and then following that, there will be time for a 5-minute rebuttal, and then each of them will do a 3-minute closing. And this is not going to be like a political debate where we're going to let them just go on and on and on and on. They agreed to this format, and they've prepared their comments to hold within those timelines. So we hope then to be done in about 40 minutes, and then they've agreed for 20 minutes of Q&A from the audience. So the time frame for tonight is about an hour. Of course, that means I got to be quiet and sit down. The two persons participating in the debate tonight are Jeremy Schwinger and Josh Stewart. Jeremy is a member of Liberty Baptist Church. He holds degrees in music ed and composition from Missouri State University and teaches orchestra and music theory in the Liberty School District. He has extensively researched many topics related to issues of apologetics, scriptural veracity, including history, textual criticism, biology, geology, genetics, cosmology, polemics. He only has 12 minutes. But he's a wonderful, engaging, amiable, and congenial person who's passionate about what he studies. He's also a musician, composer, traveler, mountain climber, and spelunker. You know what a spelunker is, don't you? He goes into caves, crawls on his belly to explore small caves, which means he cannot be claustrophobic. The other person participating in the debate tonight is Joshua Stewart. He is an atheist activist and freethinker who deconverted from fundamentalist Christianity in 2009. His entire childhood and early adulthood were steeped in Christian evangelical tradition. He is the son of a head elder of a Plymouth Brethren chapel. He's married to the daughter of a music minister from a local Christian church, and participated in all manner of church activities, youth groups, revivals, pop church movements, and is familiar with many variations of Protestant Christian doctrine and culture that is pervasive in the South. So we have two very engaging persons to talk about the topic tonight, which is the flood of Genesis. That is in Genesis chapter 6 through 8. Is it history or is it myth? So I'll invite Jeremy and Josh to come to the front, and we're going to flip a coin to decide who goes first. So guys, come on up. So, Josh, what do you call, heads or tails?
Tails. Heads it is, all right.
Okay, do you want to go first or do you want to go second?
I'll go first because he just got here. So.
Okay. Come on up to the platform. I'll invite you to the platform. And Jeremy, here we go.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. First, I want to say that I am beyond thrilled that you chose to attend this event tonight. Just by being here, you have demonstrated that you feel the discussion of the question before us is worthwhile, or at the very least, engaging. I hope that by the end of this debate, If you walk away with nothing else, all of you will have come to see how truly crucial this particular issue is. Of course, though we will be talking about the historical occurrence or lack thereof of Noah's flood, the real question that lies behind this debate is whether or not the biblical worldview is true or false. Now, some would hardly dispute whether the factuality of Noah's flood has any bearing on that matter. Unfortunately, due to time constraints, I will not be able to address that contention in my opening statements. However, I have written material that explains the basis for the belief that consistent biblical Christianity demands that the flood was both historical in nature and global in extent. Those who are interested in the matter are advised to confer with me after the debate in order for me to provide them with that information. But regardless of one's opinion on whether consistent biblical Christianity demands acceptance of Noah's flood, it is apparent that the actual historical occurrence of such an event would pose serious problems for the atheistic worldview, which is dependent on a belief in evolution by common descent for the origin of living things. This is because modeling based on observed geological processes reveals that if a flood of global proportions had occurred, it would be responsible for depositing a large part of the Earth's sedimentary rocks. This means that the Earth's fossils would not represent a record of evolution by common descent, nor would the rocks represent millions of years of uniformitarian processes at work. Rather, they would represent a single depositional event that took place within the span of approximately 1 year. Thus, if Noah's flood is a historical reality, the long ages in evolution by common descent that are so integral to the modern atheistic worldview are largely falsified. And I, along with a great many others, recognize that powerful evidence in the form of scientific observations and demonstrable facts exists to support the contention that the flood occurred. In this sense, the argument is not about science versus religion or some such nonsense. It is about good science versus bad science and true history versus false history. Now, tonight, I will be presenting two kinds of evidence for the flood: evidence that relates to verifiability and evidence that relates to feasibility. The evidence for verifiability consists of observations that are not merely compatible with a global flood. They are, in fact, extremely difficult, if not impossible, to adequately explain without one. The evidence for feasibility is of a sort that demonstrates that the flood account is reasonable and plausible, even in the light of rigorous scrutiny. Again, because of time restrictions, I will only be able to address a few items in detail. However, those interested in further evidence are welcome to converse with me after the debate. I will begin with evidence for verifiability, evidence that shows a recent global flood to be a historical reality. First, let's talk about planation surfaces. A planation surface is a large, level or nearly level land surface that has been planed flat by running water. That is, it does not result from deposition of sediments, but from erosion of existing ones. Geologists identify planation surfaces by the presence of rounded rocks, which are formed by tumbling against each other as water carries them along. Now, here are some reasons why planation surfaces point to the reality of a relatively recent global flood. First, planation surfaces cover huge portions of the Earth's surface. Just to give you an idea of how much of the land surface we're talking about, 60% of the African continent is covered by planation surfaces. In fact, eminent geomorphologists Lester King and Roll Twydale document that every single continent possesses numerous planation surfaces, many of which are quite vast. One particular planation surface just south of the Sahara Desert actually stretches 5,000 kilometers east to west and 500 kilometers north to south. Secular geology struggles to explain the sheer extent of these kinds of features. Twydale said this about the 200,000 square kilometer Nullarbor planation surface in Australia. The flatness of the Nullarbor plain has long puzzled investigators. It is not a structural feature, a single exposed bedding plane, but what degradational process could produce such a feature? Evolutionary geomorphologists Ollier and Payne made the following remark about planation surfaces in general. At present, the cause of the observed high rate of planation remains a mystery. They also stated the following: the remarkable thing is that planes of great perfection are ever made, despite all the obvious possibilities of complications. By the way, it is a demonstrable fact that no planation surfaces are being formed today, except in very rare instances and on a very small scale, such as in river flooding. Geologist Dr. Colin Crickmay stated the following about this matter: flat, near-horizontal land cannot be seen to have been made at the heights at which most of it is now seen. Such landscape as flat-topped hills or high plateaus shows no process in action that might favor or maintain its flatness. Consequently, one cannot say that any geological work now observable has made it as flat and level as it is. While such features cause secular geologists to scratch their heads, they are explained perfectly by the recessive stage of the flood, when water was pouring off the continents in tremendous sheets. The flood model is especially potent in explaining the many planation surfaces that are found on mountaintops, as an accurate rendering of the Hebrew in Psalm 104:8 indicates that today's mountains were uplifted in the latter stages of the flood. Furthermore, the flood provides the necessary conditions to produce the planation surfaces which span across tilted sedimentary rock, especially when there is a mixture of hard and soft rocks present. This is because, in such cases, the water must have been moving at a great speed in order for the different kinds of rocks to be eroded evenly and in order to facilitate the transport and deposition of large boulders. In addition, it must be noted that planation surfaces, after they are formed, are immediately assaulted by the effects of erosion, and even the smoothest ground becomes furrowed by rainwash. If these features have been exposed to the elements as long as secular geology claims they have, they should be practically unrecognizable, if not completely non-existent. In fact, measured rates of erosion estimate the average erosion rate for the world's continents to be 2.5 inches per 1,000 years. At this rate, 93 miles of sediment would have been eroded in the approximately 2.5 billion years that are assigned to the basement rocks of most of the continents in the secular geological paradigm. North America alone would be leveled in 10 million years at this rate, and secular protests that new crust forming would compensate for this are completely contradicted by observations, as well as by the geology of the areas in which they propose this compensation. One planation surface, the entirety of Kangaroo Island off the coast of Australia, 87 miles long and 37 miles wide, has been dated by secular geologists to be 160 million years old. If this is the case, how are we expected to believe that the surface is still largely intact after 160 million years of erosion? The idea that planation surfaces can be explained by long-age secular geology is utterly indefensible. In truth, only a recent global flood makes any geological sense of these extraordinary features which cover the landscape of large parts of the world. This evidence for the reality of a recent global flood is only the tip of the proverbial iceberg. I regret that I do not have the same amount of time that I apportioned to the discussion of planation surfaces to grant to each of the numerous evidences for the verifiability of the flood. Evidences such as paraconformities, polystrate fossils, thick coal seams, purity of chalk beds, fossil graveyards, tightly folded thick strata, the more than 500 global flood legends from around the world, and a scientific examination of geological icons such as the Grand Canyon, Ayers Rock, Devil's Tower, Giant's Causeway, and the Three Sisters. However, as I mentioned, those interested in additional information are welcome to come talk to me at the end of the debate. We now move on to discussing evidence for the feasibility of the flood account. And in doing so, we will look at answers to a few of the most common objections to the flood. All of these answers have been available for some time now, and they have yet to be refuted. Unfortunately, a careful search of anti-flood documents reveals that skeptics of the Bible have done little to engage with these answers, other than to lampoon them or repeat secular mantras which are completely unsupported by observational evidence. A cluster of the most common objections to the flood focuses on the source and ultimate fate of the floodwaters, as well as the supposed impossibility of these waters covering the mountains. Now, the text in Genesis 7:11 identifies two sources for the floodwaters: the fountains of the great deep and the windows of the heavens. The Hebrew for the first source most likely indicates either oceanic or subterranean sources of water, and very likely refers to both. Scientists have confirmed that the transition zone between the upper and lower mantle far beneath the Earth's surface contains a tremendous amount of water stored in the crystal lattices of minerals. In fact, there is believed to be at least 3 times as much water held there as there is in all of the Earth's oceans combined. Furthermore, there is strong evidence to indicate that some of this water would have been released at the beginning of the flood if the horizontal tectonic movements proposed by many occurred then, as a fracturing of the ocean floor would have produced linear geysers of superheated steam. Also, up to 70% of what is emitted from volcanoes is water, often in the form of vapor. The Earth's rock layers, when interpreted as a record of the flood, indicate that intense volcanism was associated with that event. Incidentally, this geologic activity we have been discussing, especially underwater volcanism and plate subduction along continental margins, would produce hypercanes, which would contribute significantly to global rainfall. A hypercane is a special type of extremely powerful hurricane shown by computer modeling to form when very high water surface temperatures are present, a condition which would have certainly resulted from the proposed volcanism at the start of the flood. These mechanisms, when taken together, are more than sufficient to explain the origin of the floodwaters. Also, in many flood models, the aforementioned mechanisms would result in the rising of the ocean floors due to hotter crust and the lowering of the continents due to the additional weight of tremendous amounts of water. This explains how the floodwaters were able to cover the mountains, which, incidentally, were not the same mountains as we have today. contrary to skeptics' frequent assertions. The top of Mount Everest, just like many other mountains, contains marine fossils embedded in water-deposited sediments. It was thus once underwater and was later pushed up by tectonic forces. According to the Hebrew in Psalm 104:8, today's mountains were pushed up near the end of the flood, and thus the waters did not need to attain heights of nearly 30,000 feet to cover the pre-flood mountains, which would have undoubtedly been much lower than that. Regardless, if the surface of the earth were smoothed out, water would cover this planet to a depth of 1.7 miles. As for the ultimate fate of the floodwaters, this can clearly be seen by looking at a modern globe. Even today, around 70% of the Earth's surface is covered by water. At the close of the flood, the cooling oceanic crust sank, causing water to pour off the continents and form features such as planation surfaces, and causing the continents to rise due to the loss of additional mass. The Bible agrees with this assessment, as Psalm 104:9 equates today's oceans with the waters of Noah's flood. Now, if time permitted, I would go on to discuss the feasibility of other specific issues, such as the construction of the ark, the number of animals on the ark, ventilation, lighting, waste disposal, and space allocations for food and water on the ark, caring for the animals during the voyage, post-flood diversification and adaptation of the biosphere, and so forth. But I trust that the depth and soundness of the information which I have presented will be assumed to be representative of the information which I lack sufficient time to present. I also trust that all of you who are present will see that Noah's flood, far from being mythical or a flight of ignorant fancy, is well supported by evidence in regards to both its verifiability and feasibility. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. So he gave his opening statement. I'm going to give mine. This is not my rebuttal of what he just said. Today's going to be confusing like that sometimes, but just so you know, that's how it's going down. All right, so my name is Joshua Stewart. I'm the activism director for the Kansas City Atheist Coalition. For those of you who don't know, we're a 501c3 nonprofit that focuses on philanthropy, community, and then also activism, which is combating what we believe to be harmful and untruthful religious myths and ideologies. Before I get started, I'd like to say I'm thankful to Nathan Rose, the pastor of Liberty Baptist Church, for getting the ball rolling on this. Also like to thank Bo Sires for his help in organizing, as well as Jeremy Schwinger, my opponent, and Dr. Pratt. Tonight is a combination event for us, but chiefly my goal this evening is to address what I think are mistaken beliefs regarding the biblical story of Noah's Ark. And I think I can better do this by first telling you all a little bit about myself. Okay. I used to be a Christian fundamentalist. I was taught growing up that the Bible was the inerrant word of God, that it was the ultimate authority on truth and reality, and if it had an opinion to offer on history, biology, astrophysics, you name it, it could be trusted. Growing up, I was taught creationism. I believed in a young earth. I believed the story of Noah's Ark was a historical fact. These were my beliefs for the majority of my life until around 2009 I began to question my faith, and after reading more about philosophy, history, and the origins of the Bible, I began to have severe doubts about my belief in God, and I gradually fell away from my Christian faith. Now, I think it's important to note that just because I didn't believe in God anymore, that didn't mean that I immediately accepted the idea of an old earth or evolution. Surprise, surprise. My creationist training was still there, and my understanding of the problems of evolutionary theory still stuck with me. I had a lot of doubts about these things, and it wasn't until I read some additional books on evolutionary biology after my deconversion that I began to change my mind on these matters. So for me, evolution and atheism are actually really separate ideas. While they are related, one does not necessarily follow from the other. Just because evolution is true, that does not mean that atheism is true. Just because Noah's flood is likely a myth, that actually doesn't mean that Christianity is false. The reason I'm telling you this is so that you understand that I don't really have a horse in this race, at least not to the extent that my opponent does. Whether Noah's Ark was real or not will not impact my beliefs very much. I, as an atheist, am perfectly comfortable with accepting Noah's flood as historical fact. Wow, right? Providing that the evidence is there. And I'm perfectly comfortable denying evolution if it can be demonstrated as false. It does not change my atheism at all, because my atheism came first before my belief in evolution. However, for fundamentalist Christians who rely so heavily on the Bible, and they rely on it being the inerrant word of God, questioning this doctrine can potentially destroy their faith. Being wrong on the issue of Noah's Ark can potentially put their salvation, their eternal hope, in jeopardy. Ken Ham actually puts it like this. He says, "The trouble with believing that the Bible contains errors is this. How do you know what's correct and what is not? How could we possibly trust the message of salvation through Christ alone is true? So I urge you all, please keep this in mind throughout the program tonight. When it comes down to questions of whose opinion you should trust, it is important to be aware of potential sources of bias. And I think the desire to preserve one's faith, considering what they think is at stake, is a powerful motivator. All right, so now let's cut to the chase. The story of the Ark. Being the massive claim that it is, it impacts the entire globe and all life on it. It treads upon the territory of multiple disciplines, including geology, archaeology, biology, and historiography. Tonight, I'm not going to try and give you a crash course in every discipline, but rather summarize the status of the flood story and its treatment by relevant experts. I will then provide what I believe to be a few convincing arguments as to why the flood story is implausible and likely to be myth rather than historical. So, firstly, from a historical perspective, most Old Testament scholars regard the biblical story and Noah's Ark as a story handed down by oral tradition, composed and edited by multiple sources. This is also the case in the New Testament with the four Gospels. The stories start out spreading by word of mouth and eventually are written down. This is pretty normal, actually, with ancient history. However, with the four Gospels, the oral sources are contemporary to the events that they relay. And no more than 100 years passes before we have multiple independent accounts documented by the Gospel writers. And this is why oral tradition, in the case of the New Testament here, can be considered reliable history. And I believe in the history of the Bible to some extent. Surprise, surprise. Unfortunately, this is not the case with the Old Testament, especially in regard to the first 12 chapters of Genesis. With these 12 chapters, the original sources are very ancient and untraceable, and oral tradition is largely not considered reliable past 100 years or so. This is because cultures that rely on the written word are much more careful about the details they write down. They like to get the facts straight, whereas cultures that rely on oral tradition, everything's kind of wishy-washy. So we don't trust it as much from a historical perspective. That's how historians treat that. The Smithsonian Department of Anthropology summarizes it this way. The factual basis of the stories are hidden from our view archaeologically. The stories remain part of folk traditions that were included in the Bible to illustrate and explain theological ideas, like where did humans come from? Where did evil come from? It is to remember that the Bible is primarily a book of religion, a guide to faith, and not a book of history, poetry, economics, or science. End quote. In short, it is closer to the genre of myth and cannot be verified as historical fact. Moving along, I'll briefly mention that the consensus among the world's earth scientists is that the world is about 4.5 billion years old, and that the majority of the world's geologists since the 19th century have dismissed the possibility of a global flood event because of the lack of evidence. That's from David R. Montgomery. He's a geologist from UC Berkeley. Also, those are probably the mantras that Jeremy was talking about, we were saying. But again, that's consensus positions, right? So if you don't agree with the consensus position, that's fine. Not only do you have to have reasons and arguments for it, you need to have a reason and argument to explain why the experts are wrong. Like, are they all just really anti-Christian? I just don't think that's possible. Do they really want to deceive everybody? Are they hiding information they don't know? I really doubt that's possible. Also mentioning briefly, it is of note that the archaeological searches for the Ark have turned up nothing but hoaxes. There are more than a few, but the most recent one I'm familiar with is that of the pseudo-archaeologist Ron Wyatt, who claimed that he discovered not only Noah's Ark, but the Ark of the Covenant as well, and the burnt ruins of Sodom and Gomorrah, and the exact spot in the Red Sea where, the armies of Pharaoh were crushed by the sea during the Israelites' crossing. Kind of sounds like quite the Indiana Jones, and I think that's kind of the persona he wanted to put on. But unfortunately, none of his findings were ever corroborated, and he produced no artifacts to be examined by his peers for review. This is pretty common. In fact, it would seem that the story of Noah's flood is not considered to be plausible by the majority of experts from any of the scientific disciplines related. All right, so on to practical problems with the story, problems with the Ark itself. I had slides prepared for this, but you're just going to have to use your imaginations. So, firstly, going off the measurements given in Genesis and the material used, that of gopher wood and pitch, the Ark would almost certainly be unseaworthy. You see, there are physical limits to how big you can build a boat made out of wood, and that limit is somewhere about 300 feet. The Ark is purported to be more than 100 feet longer than this. This is kind of analogous to trying to build a skyscraper purely out of bricks and mortar. the bricks are so heavy that once you get past a certain amount of bricks, they actually begin to crumble and crush each other under their own weight. You cannot build, what's the tallest building in the world in Dubai right now? I can't remember the name of it, or the Empire State Building. You can't build that out of bricks and mortar. It's not going to hold. It has to be made of steel. So yeah, like skyscrapers are also not rigid structures, but they actually move, they sway, and they flex with the wind around them. Something similar actually happens to wooden ships as well. Once you get to a certain length, the ship bends and flexes and literally snakes through the water like a fish. But when this happens in a wooden ship, the materials can't actually take the strain, and the boats leak constantly. We actually have an example of this. The USS Wyoming was once a ship that was actually the largest ship of its kind. It was built nearly 300 feet in length, and it leaked so badly they had to put iron braces in it to be able to keep it together. And they had to continually run pumps to keep the water from coming in and causing the ship to sink. Eventually, actually, it did end up sinking in 1924, and everyone died on board. How can we expect, like an ancient shipbuilder instead of a more modern day shipbuilder to be able to perfect that feat 100 feet even longer and do that without any training, any tradition of shipbuilding? It's just very implausible to me. 2, the flood. Though we certainly did get we can find initial objections in asking where the water come from, where did it all go, but I want to skip to something I find a little more damning. Even if we know where the water came from, was it brackish water or was it fresh water? How did salt and freshwater fish survive in the same water together? Organisms like coral are very fragile. Currently even, their survival is at risk because of climate change combined with just a few degrees of change brought out by normal weather patterns like El Nino. No doubt radical temperature changes and pressure changes would have wiped them out. So how can their existence be explained? Number 3, the geographical distribution of species. So with Noah's flood, the story goes that they landed on Mount Ararat, and they went out and they spread out from there and populated the earth. There are kind of 2 main problems with this. A, if this were the case, we would expect to see Mount Ararat as kind of like the center for expansion, all animals spread across the world. This kind of works with humans to some degree, right? When we look at it, we look at human history, but not when it comes to animals. For instance, we have like whole groups of marsupials, like kangaroos, koala bears, and what's called like the blind marsupial mole, and like they're only found in Australia. And not only are they only found in Australia, but their ancestors' remains are only found in Australia. So did they get up, go to the ark, get on it, then all of a sudden they shipwreck on Mount Ararat or whatever, and then they get off and go exactly back to the homeland where they first started, thousands of miles away across the ocean? Or would it be more likely for them with the flood model to see them kind of spread out within the general area? I think it's more plausible under the explanation provided by evolution that they evolved from a common ancestor in that same place, and they didn't take some crazy road trip somewhere. Because otherwise we'd see evidence of that. Lastly, so genetic diversity. Within Noah's family, have just a few members of his family populating the rest of the world after the flood. They're the only humans, right? Well, unfortunately, science tells us that that is actually not enough people to start the human race over again. The Amish are actually a really good example of this. They started with only some 300 German immigrants. That's 75 times that of Noah's family. And they're actually dying out because there's not enough genetic diversity within the population. Remember, they don't marry other people outside of their own group to continue their tradition on. They have so many people dying of genetic diseases, really terrible stuff, like babies being born with really tiny heads. And in general, it's predicted that they're not going to be able to continue to survive as a people group unless they get more genetic diversity or some scientific miracle, pardon the phrase, actually occurs. The story of Noah's flood is not taken seriously by the majority of scientists and scholars across disciplines. Those who do take it seriously have a strong bias to do so based on their theological presuppositions, which they are more than happy to admit that they possess. That's kind of my problem. I'm amazed at that. In the area of Mesopotamia, where floods and myths are commonplace, which is more astonishing? That the narrative of the Noah's Ark arises from folk tales and exaggerations of local floods, and it is then later written down, or that it actually occurred despite all the odds against it and the lack of evidence. Thank you for listening.
All right. First off, I would like to just talk about, I'm not going to talk about these things in sequence, so I'm going to start with a 300-foot limit for wooden ships. This is actually a historical falsehood. There are ships that are longer than 300 feet by quite a bit. The Tesseracontes was in the 3rd century BC, and it was several hundred feet longer than the Wyoming, which came several millennia later. The Leontifera, same thing. And also in China, the Admiral Zheng He had treasure junks that were even longer than Noah's Ark. And these are factual historical ships. The reason that Noah's Ark is plausible from a wooden standpoint and from a material science standpoint is because ancient ships used more time-consuming methods to build ships that modern ships did not, such as monocoque hulls, layered planking, and straight edge joining, which are much, much stronger than the methods used by the Wyoming. Also, the issue with salt and freshwater fish is a well-known fact in hydrodynamics that when you have brackish and freshwater mix, they don't mix evenly, they actually layer, and this has been seen by experiments. So salt and freshwater fish would have continued to have habitats in which to live. This is the same case for changes in pressure and temperature that fish have been shown by experiments to be able to adapt to drastic changes in both temperature and pressure. As far as the issues of biogeography and why marsupials are only found in Australia, it's not a part of the flood model to assume that animals were fossilized everywhere they traveled on the way to the places in which they ended up. For example, we know from history that there were lions in Israel, but there are no fossil lions in Israel. This belies the entire argument about biogeography, and it actually causes more problems from an evolutionary standpoint to try to explain how similar features could have occurred in radically different populations when these are extremely complicated genetic changes. As far as genetic diversity in humans, there's a couple things to consider here. First of all, 4,000 years ago, closer to the time of Noah, the human genome in general was not as degenerated, and this has been shown by scientific studies that longer-lived or long-generation species are actually going towards what's called error catastrophe. That is, mutation load is increasing. Therefore, there would have been far fewer mutations at that time. Also, there are examples of modern-day interbreeding. For example, in India, there are many consanguineous marriages, and this does not result in drastic genetic defects. In fact, there's a rapid drop-off in problems with inbreeding after the 1st and 2nd generations. I'm curious about why looking for the Ark is such an issue. If I were Noah and I had just gotten off of the Ark, first thing I would be thinking about is all the material that should not go to waste. I think it's very reasonable that Noah and his descendants would have probably dismantled the Ark for material, which was badly needed. As for one Wyatt, I share Josh's opinion. I think he's a total quack. Then going to the issue of Genesis and whether it was originated from oral tradition, there's a very important piece of knowledge about the Hebrew in Genesis. The word toldot is a Hebrew word that's actually the title of that book in Hebrew Bibles. And what it means is this is the record, or this is the written account of. And this word appears throughout the first 12 chapters of Genesis, indicating that likely Moses did compile these from written records, which means that the whole argument about oral sources really doesn't bear as much weight. And additionally, ancient people had very good oral transmission, as can be testified by societies today that memorize epics of multiple hours long, such as in Central Asia. The issue of consensus, I think this is one of the most important ones. To argue simply that consensus says this, opposes the flood and looks at 4.6 billion years old, this is a very dangerous place to be because in the past this has actually inhibited science. Think about Galileo, for example. It's actually a myth that the church were the main opponents of Galileo. It was in fact the scientists of his day who opposed him, and they had based their beliefs not on religion, but on the astronomy used by Ptolemy, a pagan astronomer. Galileo fought them, and they were the consensus. It should ultimately come down to which arguments are better. The reason that people go along with consensus, if you know the Hans Christian Andersen's fairy tale, The Emperor's New Clothes, nobody likes to be wrong, nobody likes to be an outlier. A few people, iconoclasts, but also, think about oxygen. Phlogiston used to be what people used to explain oxygen. We now know that's wrong, but that used to be the consensus. It is not a good argument to say the majority wins. Truth is decided by arguments. As far as why does the flood matter so much, in John 3:12, Jesus said, if you do not believe me when I speak of earthly things, how will you believe me when I speak of heavenly things? Additionally, Jesus in the New Testament confirmed that the flood was a historical event. So it is very serious for Christians to say, well, Jesus didn't know what he was talking about.
All right. Rebuttals are weird, I think. So yeah, we actually did exchange opening statements. This is completely blind, so Jeremy did great being able to address all those things. It's awesome. So it turns out, I don't know, just Google searching here, basically it looks like wooden ships were longer. However, for the most part, it seems like those ships have to be reinforced with metal in order to continue to be seaworthy. So I encourage you all to look that up afterwards if you want to. With the largest wooden ship that was purely, like close to that length, it was still leaking, even though they had metal bands and whatnot. And so to have a ship that long that's just made of wood sounds like it's completely impossible, based on the examples that we have. Let's see. Let's go back to kind of his opening statement a little bit. So I contend with the idea that evolution poses a problem for atheism. Again, like, I was an atheist before I believed in evolution. Like, I find contradictions in the Christian God all over the place. I don't have to just buy into evolution or to somehow disprove him. In fact, I don't think that's even possible, because there are Christians, very strong Christians who seem to exemplify the fruits of the Spirit that you would look for in a true Christian, that seem to have no problem believing in evolution, and even think that it gives evidence for the creation, or for God, even though I actually disagree with that. Also, it really bothers me a little bit how often Jeremy seems to be quoting Psalms for his historical information. As far as I know, I mean, even from a biblical perspective, poetry is not historical evidence, and to be invoking that, and then invoking John, in terms of what Jesus said. John is the least historically reliable of the Gospels, and there are Christians who agree with me on that. That's not a fringe position by any means. And so his biblical references for what he has to support seem sketch also at best. As far as the issue goes for salt water and brackish water and freshwater layering, again, that's kind of fine. But and some fish I'm sure could survive it. There are examples of fish you can bring up from the depths, and if you get them adjusted all right, they'll make it. But having their habitat displaced though for years, for over a year, to have coral, something as sensitive an organism as that a few degrees of temperature or pressure can change their entire existence. I don't think everything that we see today could have survived that kind of cataclysmic transition. And to just provide a few examples of that isn't very thorough, even though I understand we're limited on time. Let's see, I think for the most part, actually, since he addressed everything. Genetic diversity. As far as Noah's family somehow having more diversity in their genes than other people, I don't know that that's actually true. I would really like to fact check that. I can't seem to at the moment. But that seems highly implausible to me. If humans today are having problems with that, then it seems to me that it's not unreasonable to assume that that would be a problem in the past. Especially when it's that severe, when it's just one freaking family versus 300 German immigrants now. And yeah, last but not least, I don't know, I think we're having a debate behind the debate here, and the debate is about inerrancy. The debate is about the reliability of the Bible. And I feel fundamentalists in general are very terrified of this idea of the Bible at all being proven wrong in any way. And I think that's really telltale, and we really got to get over that. I don't think it's plausible, and I don't think Christianity has to necessarily disappear because of it. It bothers me that there's a statement called the Chicago Statement of Inerrancy. It actually is probably the most authoritarian interdenominational document regarding the doctrine of inerrancy, shared by a lot of Southern Baptist churches, if not all, if I'm not mistaken. But it even said, there's a line there that says, we deny that any scientific theory could come up and change what we believe about what this book actually says. And that bothers me, that really bothers me. I mean, put the shoe on the other foot. If I said that it doesn't matter what scientific evidence is out there, I'll believe this no matter what. Would you trust me for a second? Would you not be intensely skeptical? That really bothers me, and it should you, I think, as well. So that's all I have to say. Thank you very much.
In preparing for this debate, the very first thing I did was search for best arguments against a global flood on the internet. I encountered several essays I had run into before, including one against which I had previously written an extensive refutation. I found a whole lot of material, but what I did not find was any coherent objections to the flood that had not already been refuted in the relevant literature. You've heard my opponent make a number of claims tonight, claims which, ultimately, are unsubstantiated and appear to have been formulated apart from taking the strongest arguments for the flood into consideration. This, unfortunately, is typical for critics of the flood and critics of the Bible, for that matter. If you currently disbelieve the Bible's account of a global flood, I submit this plea to you. Don't assume that you know all there is to know about the matter. If you want to adequately defend your worldview, don't turn only to surface-level arguments and discussions. Dig and dig deep. I get it, it's hard. It takes a lot of time to look into things at a deep level. But materials are out there that explain the evidence for the flood and address the objections against it. I can point interested parties to those resources after the debate if they so desire. I highly recommend that all of you thoroughly investigate those materials. But please, above all, I implore you to be circumspect. Circumspect in its original form is an adjective that refers to carefully looking around. I take no pleasure in saying that I have not met one single person in my entire life who rejects the Bible and its account of the flood who has been completely circumspect with regard to evidence for those matters. In other words, I firmly believe that those who deny Scripture do so for only two reasons. They choose to disbelieve in spite of the evidence, or they disbelieve because they do not know all of the evidence. And it doesn't make the problem go away to say that believing in the Bible and the flood and so forth is a faith position, as some are apt to say. Faith is never contrasted with evidence in Scripture. It's contrasted with sight. And history is something we cannot truly see. We can see its effects, but we can't see history itself. In that sense, belief in any history is an act of faith. So, as I said in my opening statements, it's not a matter of science versus faith or religion or worldview. It's a matter of good science versus bad science and a true worldview versus false worldviews. Now, as I close, I want to point out that the most important issue at stake in this argument is not merely whether a global flood occurred or not. For in the Bible, the flood and the ark point to something that is far more serious than physical death or physical salvation. Both Jesus and Peter state in the New Testament that just as God judged the world in the time of Noah, he will judge all mankind at the end of this world as we know it. And the basis for us believing that he will make good on that promise is the fact that the global flood occurred in history. But just as Noah and his family were saved by the ark, there is an ark in our day which has been provided for the salvation of both our bodies and our souls. That ark is Jesus Christ, and only in him can we escape the righteous and just judgments against the wickedness of man that is to come. That's why he died on the cross in our place and then resurrected from the dead. Thank you for attending tonight, and please take these things to heart.
I'll just echo a little bit of what Jeremy said. Like, digging for yourself, looking for yourself for these answers is really important, and I have to agree with that. Fact check me, fact check him, do what you need to do. Like, those are values that I think we both share. On this issue of like authority and who do you trust, we're not all, like Jeremy and I are not qualified experts in this field either. And to some degree, even the factual information that we get, we have to rely on experts for that. And you here in the audience, not necessarily listening to just Jeremy and myself, you're listening to other people too, but you have to make decisions on who to trust. And you don't always have, we don't have this libertarian ideal that you can access all information and look at all the facts to make the most perfect decision. That'd be wonderful if you could on everything ever. It's not possible. So at some point you have to figure out who you trust. And like, and look for things like bias. And look for those things like, majority of experts in the relevant field. Those are philosophical principles. They're not absolute. You can't rely on that and say that this is true because an expert says. But you can infer that it's likely. And things like that are important mechanics for us to figure out who to believe and what to do with our lives. And as we continue in doing that, I encourage you to look at that. So thank you so much for listening, and I guess we'll take questions here shortly.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, Joshua. Let's once again show our appreciation for these two who prepared. Okay, we had projected that we could get done in an hour. If you're here and an hour was your time frame and you need to go, we're going to do about 15 or 20 minutes of Q&A. But if you need to go, please feel free to do that, and you will not be in any way thought the less of, because we said we would work for an hour. Now, we're going to do Q&A, and that means if you have a question, not a statement, not if you'd like to be the third person in the debate, and give us the benefit of your wisdom and knowledge. So let's try to have questions, and not prefaced by long statements, but really have questions that the gentleman can respond to. So who would like to ask the first question? Yes.
So, my question is for the gentleman representing the biblical view. And I want to make sure that I'm coming from an assumption of your worldview that is correct. So please correct me if I'm wrong. You believe that organisms as we have today, bacteria, viruses, animals, plants, not accounting for intraspecies diversification, existed in Noah's time and even preceding Noah's time. Is that correct?
Pretty close. I would say that the only distinction is that term species, because the term that I would use is a biological term, syngamion, which is the widest inclusive term of interbreeding or animal relatedness.
So my question is, we have things like viruses like rabies, which cannot survive outside the human body for more than a few days. That's even within bodily fluids, and kills its host within 2 years, or for the few cases where someone has survived, has left them with severe neurological damage. How did that virus survive the global flood?
I would say there are quite a few different ways that it could have survived. Of course, we don't know how it actually did, but I think there's a lot of possible ways that it could. For one thing, viruses, and we've actually watched this, they can have degenerative changes that actually make them only able to survive in a specific host, whereas before they were able to survive in a host that is not alive, or they don't need to parasitize. They could also perhaps have survived in bloating carcasses. They could have survived in animals or individuals on the ark in latent form, where they weren't actually pathogenic at that point. Yeah.
I do have a question for you, Jeremy.
Okay.
So I know you referenced in your first speech on the issue of like mass fossil graves. And my understanding of the flood is that it was used to essentially like punish human beings and eliminate people from the earth. How do you explain the lack of human remains in these fossil graves?
I think there's a couple. Yeah, sorry. Absolutely.
Please state the question in case we.
Okay, the question is about mass fossil graveyards that in the flood paradigm would have resulted from the flood. And the question is, where are the human fossils? Which is a very good question. I think there's a couple reasons why we would not expect to find many human fossils. For one thing, we find very few vertebrate fossils comparatively, and even fewer of those have more than one bone. I think the percentage is like 0.25% or something like that of the entire fossil record. Very, very, very small. Also, with the flood, the model implies that this was not all at once a huge wave overswept all of the continents, but rather that there were stages of advance and retreat. And there's also the issue of differential mobility. That is, that humans would be perhaps most likely to be able to find ways to escape, to try to get around in rafts and things like that while they could. But also the bloating of carcasses, things like that, I think are reasons why we would not really expect to find human fossils.
I have a question for either one of you that would like to answer this, but as I look in chapter 6, my question is, why are we not finding the remains of the Nephilim? I see that the sons of God took wives from the daughters of men, and they had babies that grew up to be giants, according to King James Version, also the Nephilim. First of all, how is that even possible for people to have offspring that become giants? And are you expecting to find fossils of these giant peoples or artifacts such as hand tools, farming implements, furniture?
Do you mind if I speak to that?
Yeah, go for
Okay.
it.
I feel like that's probably, Okay, so for one thing, the Nephilim would have been very human-like, so that what we just talked about with human fossils would apply to them. But secondly, the term giants is not a good translation of that. I know it comes from the King James. The King James got that term from the Greek word gigantes, which of course is where we get gigantic. This was a translation used in a version of the Bible called the Septuagint. It was a Greek version made from the Hebrew. The reason this word was chosen is because of what gigantes actually means in a Greek context, which is titans. The Hebrew word nephilim means the fallen ones. So some commentators think that these were simply offspring of two different human lineages. Others think that angels, because the Bible teaches that angels can take human form, that's within their ability to do. As such, they would have genitalia and would be able to propagate with human women. So there's a couple different views on that there, but Scripture is not very clear about it. What's certain about the Nephilim is that they were human-like, that they were simply fallen in nature. And so, like I said earlier, the reason that we would not expect to find fossils of them is that for the same reason that we would not expect to find fossils of humans.
Okay. I have a follow-up question. Okay, will they also appear later in the Bible in the book of Numbers?
Yes.
Chapter 13? And the warriors are looking at them and they're afraid of these guys because they feel like they are grasshoppers compared to the
Yes,
size of
okay,
these
good
guys.
question.
And if God intended to kill all these Nephilim, did he fail?
So the reference that you're referring to in Numbers, this is a report made by spies who ultimately are rebelling against what God has told them to do. And the Greek there in the Septuagint is kakos, which means basically a bad or untrustworthy report. In other words, these guys were not telling the truth, i.e. there were no Nephilim at that time.
So it's literal except at that one.
Yes, sir.
What would change, Josh kind of close to what would change his mind, so what would change your mind?
As far as evidence for
Whatever, what would...
disbelieving the flood.
Yeah.
Repeat the question.
Okay, he's asking, or he's stating that Josh had said, you know, he gave reasons for what would change his mind about his views, and he's asking what would change my mind about my views. I am going to go back to that verse in John 3:12, that Jesus said, if you do not believe me about earthly things, how will you believe me about heavenly things? Jesus understands, and God understands, that we are human. And that we do have to deal with our physicality. So he gives us physical evidence. So you will notice in my presentation, most of what I talked about in my opening statements was physical evidence, outside of the Bible, basically saying, how do you explain this out without huge amounts of water? So for me, I would actually need to see evidence, for example, of how information could increase in a genome to believe evolution, and that evidence I've been looking for years and haven't found it. And so for like the flood model, I would need to find reasonable secular explanations for how many of the features of the geological record occur, such as polystrate fossils that extend through many, many layers, which in a uniformitarian paradigm is millions of years. How did those trees just sit there all that time and nothing happened to them? I would need a reasonable explanation to change my mind about that. So I do believe in biblical inerrancy, but I believe it because of the evidence, the physical evidence.
Question over here.
Do you believe in the biblical sense that it was the 40 days and 40 nights of rain that caused the flood?
Okay. In my opening statements, I made reference to two different sources for the floodwaters. One is the fountains of the deep, and the secondary source is the windows of heaven. So in other words, I believe the primary source of the waters, as indicated by the Hebrew, came from below, and the water from above, the rain, was a secondary source.
And when you say below, kind of what is
Beneath the earth, subterranean sources of water. Remember, I talked about the crystal lattices of minerals and how they had 3 times as much as all of the Earth's oceans combined in them.
Do you believe in like the ice age and everything that happened, that's scientifically proven to happen throughout the world?
Absolutely. In fact, I'm glad you asked that, because the flood is really the only thing that explains that. I oftentimes ask people this question if they ask about the ice age. If you were in charge of the Earth's climate, how would you make an ice age? And most people answer, I would make the Earth colder. That does not produce an ice age. It produces a frozen desert. An ice age requires increased precipitation. Only the flood could provide this with warm floodwaters and cool continents, also with lots of aerosols in the air from volcanism, blocking out the sunlight. You would have increased precipitation and ice sheet buildup directly after the flood.
But to go along with that, like the flood, do you believe, I know with global warming today and ice caps causing, inches for coastal regions going underwater, do you believe that on an increased scale, such as an ice age, that if there was a global warm, where I guess it decreased it at a sudden change, like and just left it to where the remains of the polar caps we have today were all that's left, and it caused a very vast melting of the larger amounts of these polar caps, do you think that could have caused the flood instead of the sources you provided?
No, because the physical, the geological evidence looking at oxygen isotopes and foraminifera show that that ice age occurred later in the Cenozoic record, or what's commonly called the Cenozoic record in the uniformitarian paradigm.
I think there's a question.
The question is for Josh.
I have a question for you, actually.
Okay.
Kind of a follow-up to the giant thing.
Uh-huh.
So yeah, in 2 Samuel, the term translated giant, the giant can mean Raphim. This apparently was a race or breed of giants, such as Og, the king of Bashan, whose bedstead was 13.5 feet in length and 6 feet wide, according to Deuteronomy 3:3 and Joshua 12:4. I don't know, it seems like there's more references to giants than just like an accidental one and a lie. Do you have anything to say about those?
So these are two different Hebrew words here. Nephilim is from the Hebrew word nephal, which means to fall.
Right.
And then this one that you mentioned, Raphim, is different. It actually means large people. The largest man in recent history was Robert Wadlow, who was 8'11", and he was not very old at the time. I believe he was 22 when he died, and he showed no signs of slowing down. So the sizes of humans listed in those passages is entirely within the realm of possibility.
Yes.
I got a question for you. Okay. As far as science of plate tectonics
Mhm.
and the way all the continents seem to be able to fit together like a undulating, do you feel like that's the way the Earth was prior to the flood, and then with the flood you had the separation of the continents, or when do you feel like all that?
Okay, that's a really good question too. Personally, I think there's a lot of promise in what's called a CPT model, that's catastrophic plate tectonics. This has been developed by a guy named Dr. John Baumgartner. He actually is credited with inventing the most widely used and most widely respected supercomputer modeling of plate tectonics. This is not just for Christians, this is for everybody. And he believes that there was a lot of plate tectonic movement during the flood, and that at the start of it, they were all together and then they moved apart to their present locations. And there are a lot of evidences for this. For example, in the mantle, that's the part beneath the lithosphere, beneath the crust of the Earth, there are these slabs of continents that extend down a long way and are not incorporated into the mantle. In other words, they're much colder than the material around them, which if they had taken a very long time to go down, they would have, by all rights, melded into the material. Also, as evidence of this, he points to the fact that the current rates of motion in plate movement would not be strong enough to push up, for example, the Himalayas. So that's like 2 to 11 centimeters per year, I think it is, or something like that, of movement that's detectable. That would not be enough by secular scientists. So they have to resort to ad hoc hypotheses to produce the mountains.
Yes, sir.
So Jeremy, you mentioned you believe in scriptural inerrancy, and in response to this gentleman's question back here, you mentioned translation error in King James Bible. So for the modern Christian, which version of the Bible do we look to for that scriptural inerrancy when it's acknowledged?
So the doctrine of, yeah, good question. The doctrine of inerrancy refers to the original manuscripts, which the King James Version is not an original manuscript, it's a translation. In fact, a lot of words, for example, even in William Shakespeare's time, starve meant to die. It didn't mean necessarily to die by not eating enough food. Words change meanings. That word gigantes in Greek does mean large, but you have to go back to the Hebrew to see what it is, so that doesn't affect the doctrine of inerrancy.
So what do modern, and the second part of my question was, what do modern people look to? What do you look to support your positions?
Oh, okay.
What version are you quoting? Do you quote the Bible?
I try to do as much research as I can on the original manuscripts, on the original text. So I've studied some Hebrew, I've studied some Greek. I would like to study more. I want to know as much as I can so that I'm not just relying on what people say about the original languages. I would like to know them. Yeah.
Do we have the original text?
No, and that's actually not a concern, because for any ancient manuscript, the autographs don't exist. The autograph is, let's say, Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars. The handwritten copy by Julius Caesar or his scribe, we don't have those for any ancient manuscript. But what is amazing about the Bible is that we have so many manuscripts. For the New Testament, we have 24,600. For the Old Testament, 12,500 comparable manuscripts. I mean, those are actually the highest of all manuscripts in the ancient world. Third place is the Iliad with 643, which, by the way, the ancient Greeks viewed the Iliad with the same seriousness that modern-day evangelical Christians view the scriptures. And most of the manuscripts are much less than that. For example, Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars that I mentioned only has 9 or 10, and some only have 3 or 4. And people don't question the authenticity of these manuscripts, but they attack the Bible on a routine basis.
Can I say one thing?
Yes.
Okay. Just that we don't consider the Gallic Wars or the Iliad to be inerrant, like because we don't have the originals, because the manuscripts are fallible, because people are people, things get lost. I don't know. I don't understand why we can like assume something that's inerrant.
Because
that we don't have.
Because the Gallic Wars does not claim to be divine revelation. Documents that claim to be divine revelation should be taken very seriously, either as being complete falsehood, or super sketchy at the very least, or, look at them and see, are they true? Do they match up with external evidence?
How can a document with multiple authors, with multiple viewpoints, claim to be inerrant? Would not those people all have to agree, and you not just cherry pick one author and think he means the same thing for the other person?
I don't understand that question.
Basically, like, you have multiple people writing a book over several hundred years, right? The Old Testament is thousands of years. So if one person in that book says, this is inerrant, is he not just meaning his words? Why do you think he's meaning words that are going to be written after him are also included in that canon?
Because if you look through the books of Scripture, these spokesmen of God say, this is the word of the Lord. In other words, they make that very serious claim.
So they can speak for other people who haven't even written books yet, even though they're living in their time and place.
Those people say that as well. But I am going to say, I'm not going to debate you.
That's fine.
And I feel really bad hogging the microphone, honestly. So I know a lot of people have questions for me, but if there are any people that have questions for Josh, I'd appreciate those being directed to him.
Yes, hey buddy.
Hey, how's it going?
Good? Eugene!
It's me.
Hey buddy! You would be the one who had a question for me.
Well, no, I figured like
I love you.
asking you, so I should
It's
give you
it's
something.
great.
It's my time. I guess this question for you, and then also I'd love to hear your perspective as well. You'll have alluded to the fact that not all Christians take this perspective on the literal historicity of a global flood.
Right.
Do you regard people who claim the title of Christian but don't go that direction to be less committed to the faith, or in some way compromisers?
Absolutely not. I mean, I don't know, like some of the strongest Christians I know, I mean that from an intellectual level and from a character level, also, like think that evolution is true. I think there's an example of a person in our community. Some of you may know him as Fred Heron. He writes books on this. Like he's an educator as far as evolutionary biology is concerned, and he's a Christian. And he thinks that evolution actually shows that Christianity is true. And like he spends a lot of his time, educating Christians who think that evolution is false, that it is true. And he does also spend a lot of his time just researching these things for his own sake. Like I can't think of somebody who's more committed to truth and being accurate than Fred Heron. I also can't think of somebody who has a better character than Fred Heron in that terms, and in those terms. It's like, no, of course not. You're not a weak in any way. And doctrine of inerrancy, it's like, even then you can probably like still maintain a version of it and not believe it as literal truth. Like you can think of it as inerrant, but just the genre changes. The genre changes from history to one of poetry or theological interpretation. And you can get truth out of the Psalms and not necessarily take them to be historical record, which is a genre of misunderstanding of my mind. And so yeah, but like I was attacking more or less what I understand the formulated doctrine of inerrancy as stated by the Chicago Statement. Anyway, never mind. That's all I got.
Okay. This specific question, Jeremy, specifically within our shared denomination, we've got guys that don't hold to your perspective. The somewhat controversial Wade Wilson comes to mind. Even William Dempsey, until he was threatened with being fired, didn't hold to this view. Do you perceive them to be less committed Christians or less?
No, the question is not of commitment. It's about being consistent and being logically consistent. It doesn't affect salvation at all. I think it just weakens their position, and it's not consistent with what Scripture says. And ultimately, because I do know quite a bit about Hebrew, I know what the genre of Genesis is. I know how Hebrew poetry works. I know a tremendous amount about genre, and that's why I'm convinced that It is. In fact, there's a great quote by James Barr that I recommend you all look up. His name is James, the normal spelling, B-A-R-R. And he was a professor of Hebrew at Oxford University, and he said, look guys, I don't believe the Genesis text as history, but he said, just from a Hebrew and a genre perspective, there's no disputation about whether the Hebrews clearly intended for this to teach a historical event.
We've run out of time, but I don't think that discussion is going to be short. So thank you very much for being here. Let's thank our debaters.